The gunshot echoed across the dusty plains of Montana Territory. 1872, sending Gabriella Hayes fleeing through the night with nothing but the clothes on her back and her father's gold pocket watch clutched in her trembling hand. Her lungs burned as she ran, the memory of her father's blood spilling across their cabin floor still fresh in her mind. "Keep running, Gabby," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. "They will find you if you stop." 3 days earlier, Gabriella had witnessed something she shouldn't have: a secret meeting between the newly appointed territorial judge and members of the notorious Blackwell gang. Now her father was dead, and she was marked for death, carrying knowledge that powerful men would kill to keep buried. The moon disappeared behind a cloud, plunging the landscape into darkness. Gabriella stumbled, her boot catching on a rock, sending her tumbling down a small embankment. Pain shot through her ankle as she landed hard on the ground below. She bit her lip to keep from crying out, knowing that any sound might give away her position to the men who hunted her. In the distance, she could see the faint glow of lanterns from the small settlement of Whispering Pines. It wasn't much, a handful of buildings clustered around a single dirt street, but it represented her only hope of survival. Limping badly now, Gabriella forced herself forward. The voices of the territorial judge echoed in her mind. "Find her, kill her. She'll never be safe as long as she draws breath." The town was quiet as she slipped between buildings, searching for anywhere to hide. Most windows were dark, the decent folk of Whispering Pines long since retired for the night. Only the saloon showed signs of life, yellow lights spilling from its windows along with the sounds of a piano and raucous laughter. Gabriella hesitated at the rear entrance of the saloon. She had been raised a proper lady, and places like this were forbidden to women of good standing. But proper ladies weren't hunted by killers, and proper ladies hadn't watched their fathers murdered before their eyes. She pushed open the door and slipped inside. The back room was cramped and filled with crates of whiskey and beer. Voices drifted through the thin walls from the main room. Gabriella sank down behind a stack of crates, drawing her knees to her chest, trying to make herself as small as possible. "I'm telling you, Sullivan, the girl is headed this way." The voice was rough, belonging to a man Gabriella recognized as one of the judge's hired guns. "Judge Blackwell wants her found by sunrise, or we're all answering for it. What's so important about one girl?" This voice was different, deep and steady with a slight drawl. "She saw something she shouldn't have. That's all you need to know. Seems to me that if the judge is sending his dogs after an innocent girl, maybe what she saw is exactly what folks should know. You looking to die, Sullivan? Because that's the kind of talk that gets men buried." There was a long pause, and Gabriella held her breath, pressing herself further into the shadows. "I'm looking to finish my drink in peace," the man called Sullivan finally said. "So why don't you and your friends take your business elsewhere?" Heavy footsteps crossed the floor, followed by the sound of the saloon doors swinging open, then closed. Gabriella released her breath slowly, her entire body trembling with exhaustion and fear. She needed to move to keep running, but her body refused to cooperate. Her eyelids grew heavy, and despite her best efforts, she slipped into an uneasy sleep. She awakened to the feeling of being watched. Opening her eyes, she found herself staring into the face of a man crouched before her. Panic surged through her, and she scrambled backward, only to find herself cornered against the wall. "Easy now," the man said softly, raising his hands to show they were empty. "I'm not going to hurt you." He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell to his collar and a neatly trimmed beard that did little to soften the hard angles of his face. His eyes, though, were the warm brown of freshly turned earth after a spring rain. "Are you Gabriella Hayes?" he asked. She tensed, ready to bolt, though there was nowhere to run. "How do you know my name? Those men who were looking for you weren't exactly quiet about it." He offered a small smile. "I'm Samuel Sullivan. Most folks just call me Sullivan." "You're the man they were talking to," Gabriella said, recognition dawning. "The one who told them to leave." Sullivan nodded. "I don't much care for men who hunt women." He glanced toward the door. "They'll be back at first light with more men. Whatever you saw, they're mighty determined to make sure you don't tell anyone else." "I saw Judge Blackwell meeting with the Blackwell gang," Gabriella said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's supposed to be prosecuting them, but he was giving them information about gold shipments. My father was the bank manager. He refused to cooperate with their scheme." Her voice broke. "They killed him right in front of me." Sullivan's expression darkened. "Judge Blackwell has half the territory in his pocket, including the sheriff in these parts." "Then I need to keep moving," Gabriella said, struggling to her feet. Her ankle protested, sending sharp pain up her leg. "You're hurt," Sullivan observed, "and exhausted. You won't make it 5 miles in your condition." "I don't have a choice," she said, fighting back tears of frustration. "They said I'll never be safe." Sullivan was quiet for a long moment, his gaze steady on her face. When he spoke, his voice was firm with resolve. "Then I'll be your safety." Gabriella stared at him. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," Sullivan replied. "I know you're in trouble. I know you're telling the truth. I've had my suspicions about the judge for some time, and I know I can help you." "Why would you risk your life for a stranger?" Sullivan's eyes grew distant. "Let's just say I've got my reasons for standing against men like Blackwell." He extended his hand to her. "Do you trust me, Miss Hayes?" Gabriella hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in his. "I don't have much choice, do I, Mr. Sullivan?" "Sullivan," he corrected with a small smile. "Just Sullivan." He led her through the back door of the saloon to where a magnificent chestnut stallion was tethered. "This is Thunder," Sullivan said, patting the horse's neck. "He's the fastest horse in the territory and loyal as they come." Sullivan helped Gabriella mount, then swung up behind her. The solid warmth of his chest against her back was oddly comforting after days of terror and solitude. "Where are we going?" she asked as they rode away from Whispering Pines, the town's few lights fading behind them. "I've got a cabin up in the foothills," Sullivan said. "It's remote. Hard to find if you don't know it's there. We'll be safe while we figure out our next move." Gabriella wanted to believe him, but fear had become her constant companion. "They'll never stop looking for me." Sullivan's arms tightened slightly around her as he guided Thunder through a narrow pass between rocky outcroppings. "Then we'll just have to make sure they never find you." They rode through the night, the moon occasionally emerging from behind clouds to light their way. Gabriella found herself drifting in and out of consciousness, lulled by the rhythmic movement of the horse and the steady presence of Sullivan behind her. She awoke fully as the first light of dawn painted the eastern sky. They had climbed higher into the foothills, and the air was cooler, tinged with the scent of pine. Ahead, nestled against the side of a hill and surrounded by trees, stood a small cabin. "Home," Sullivan said simply as he brought Thunder to a halt and dismounted. He reached up to help Gabriella down, his hands strong and sure at her waist. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet touched the ground, her body stiff from the long ride and weakened by days without proper food or rest. Sullivan caught her before she could fall, one arm around her waist. "Easy now," he murmured. "Let's get you inside." The cabin was simple but well built, with a stone fireplace at one end and sturdy furnishings crafted by skilled hands. Sullivan helped Gabriella to a chair near the fireplace, then busied himself lighting a fire and putting coffee on to boil. "Are you hungry?" he asked, glancing over his shoulder at her. Gabriella nodded, suddenly aware of the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. "I haven't eaten since." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Sullivan moved with quiet efficiency, preparing a simple meal of cornbread and jerky. "It's not much," he said as he set a plate before her, "but it'll keep your strength up until I can hunt properly." "It's perfect," Gabriella assured him, already taking a bite of the cornbread. "Thank you." Sullivan watched her eat for a moment, then turned away to tend to his horse. When he returned, Gabriella had finished her meal and was fighting to keep her eyes open. "There's a bed through that door," Sullivan said, nodding toward a small room off the main living area. "You should rest. No one knows about this place. You're safe here." Gabriella wanted to argue, to insist that they needed to keep moving, but exhaustion won out. She allowed Sullivan to lead her to the small bedroom, where a bed with a handmade quilt awaited. "I'll be right outside if you need anything," he promised as he backed toward the door. "Sullivan," Gabriella called as he turned to leave. He paused, looking back at her. "Thank you for everything." He nodded once, his expression unreadable, then pulled the door closed behind him. Gabriella sank onto the bed, her body heavy with fatigue. Despite her fear, despite the danger that still pursued her, she felt safer than she had in days. As she drifted off to sleep, her last thought was of Sullivan's steady voice making a promise she desperately wanted to believe. "Then I'll be your safety." The sun was high in the sky when Gabriella finally awakened. For a moment, she was disoriented, the unfamiliar surroundings causing a spike of panic until memory returned. Sullivan's cabin. Safety, at least for now. She rose from the bed, wincing as her weight settled on her injured ankle. It was better than the night before, but still tender. Moving to the small window, she peered out at the clearing around the cabin. Sullivan was there, chopping wood with powerful, efficient strokes. His shirt was off, revealing a broad back marked with scars that spoke of a hard life. Gabriella turned away from the window, feeling heat rise to her cheeks at having watched him unawares. She found a basin of clean water had been left for her, along with a sliver of soap and a clean if somewhat worn shirt that must belong to Sullivan. Grateful for the chance to clean up, Gabriella washed away days of dirt and fear, then changed into the offered shirt, which hung nearly to her knees. Her own clothes she washed in the basin, hoping they would dry quickly. When she emerged from the bedroom, Sullivan was just coming through the front door, arms laden with split wood. He stopped short at the sight of her, his gaze taking in her damp hair and his oversized shirt before quickly averting his eyes. "You're awake," he said unnecessarily, moving to stack the wood beside the fireplace. "How's the ankle?" "Better," Gabriella replied. "Thank you for the clothes and the water." Sullivan nodded, still not quite looking at her. "Figured you'd want to wash up. There's a stream about 50 yards behind the cabin if you need more water." He busied himself with building up the fire. "I was about to make some stew. Got a rabbit earlier." "I can help," Gabriella offered, moving toward the small kitchen area. "It's the least I can do." Together, they prepared a simple but hearty stew, working in companionable silence that gradually gave way to conversation. "How long have you had this cabin?" Gabriella asked as she chopped wild onions Sullivan had gathered. "Built it about 3 years ago," he replied, skinning the rabbit with practiced movements. "Needed a place away from towns and people." "You don't like people?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Some people I like just fine, but after the war I found I needed quiet more than company." "You fought in the war?" Gabriella asked, though the scars she'd glimpsed on his back had already suggested as much. Sullivan nodded. "Union cavalry, saw things no man should see." His hands stilled for a moment, his eyes distant. "Did things no man should have to do." Gabriella sensed the weight of memories pressing down on him. "My father said the war changed many good men. Your father sounds like a wise man." Sullivan resumed his work, his movements precise and controlled. "Tell me about him." And so, as they prepared the meal, Gabriella told Sullivan about her father, his quiet strength, his unwavering principles, his love for her mother who had died of fever when Gabriella was just 14. She spoke of his position as bank manager in the growing town of Helena, of his dream to see her educated and independent. "He taught me to read ledgers and balance accounts," she said with a small smile. "Said a woman should always be able to make her own way if need be." "He was right," Sullivan agreed, setting the pot of stew over the fire to cook. "Though I imagine a lady with your upbringing had other prospects." Gabriella thought of the suitors her father had politely but firmly turned away, the aspiring politicians and businessmen who saw her as a path to respectability or her father's connections. None that interested me, she admitted. I always thought there should be more to marriage than advantageous connections. Sullivan's eyes met hers briefly, something unreadable flickering in their depths. There should be, he agreed quietly. They ate their stew as afternoon faded toward evening, the conversation turning to more immediate concerns. Judge Blackwell will have men searching every town and settlement within 100 miles, Sullivan said, his expression grim. But they won't find this place easily. We can stay here while we figure out what to do. What can we do? Gabriella asked, setting aside her empty bowl. You said yourself the judge has half the territory in his pocket. Not everyone, Sullivan replied. There's a federal marshal I know, a man named James Cooper. He's been trying to build a case against the Blackwell gang for years. Your testimony could be exactly what he needs. Hope flickered in Gabriella's heart, quickly tempered by caution. How do we reach him without the judge's men finding us first? Cooper moves around a lot, but he usually checks in at Fort Benton every few weeks. I can get word to him. Sullivan studied her face. But it means leaving you here alone for a day or two. Fear seized Gabriella at the thought, but she forced herself to be practical. When would you go? Tomorrow, Sullivan said. The sooner Cooper knows what you saw, the better. And there are supplies we need if we're going to stay here long. Gabriella nodded, fighting to keep her expression calm despite the anxiety churning inside her. I'll be fine. Sullivan regarded her with those perceptive eyes that seemed to see right through her brave facade. You're not fine, he said gently, but you're stronger than you know, Gabriella Hayes. The way he said her name soft yet certain made something flutter in her chest. My friends call me Gabby, she said, surprising herself. A small smile curved Sullivan's lips. Gabby, he repeated, testing the name. It suits you. That night, Sullivan insisted Gabriella take the bed again while he slept on a bedroll near the fireplace. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her as she listened to the night sounds, the distant howl of wolves, the whisper of wind through pine needles, and the occasional creak of floorboards as Sullivan moved restlessly in his makeshift bed. She thought of her father, of the life she had lost so suddenly, and tears slipped silently down her cheeks. She had not allowed herself to truly grieve, too consumed by the immediate need to survive. Now, in the relative safety of Sullivan's cabin, sorrow washed over her in waves. She must have made some sound, for suddenly Sullivan was at her door, his silhouette outlined by the dying firelight. Gabby. His voice was low with concern. Are you all right? She wiped hastily at her tears. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to disturb you. Sullivan hesitated, then moved to sit on the edge of the bed, his weight causing the simple frame to creak slightly. You didn't disturb me. I wasn't sleeping well anyway. In the dim light, Gabriella could just make out his features, the strong line of his jaw, the furrow between his brows. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his hand where it rested on the quilt. Tell me something about yourself, she requested softly. Something from before the war. Sullivan was quiet for so long that Gabriella thought he might not answer. Then, his voice barely above a whisper, he began to speak. I grew up in Kentucky. My father raised horses the finest in the county, he always said. My mother tended a garden that was the envy of every woman for 20 miles. A small smile touched his lips at the memory. I had 2 sisters, both younger, Mary and Elizabeth. They used to follow me everywhere, driving me half mad with their chatter and questions. Where are they now? Gabriella asked. The smile faded from Sullivan's face. Gone, all of them, raid during the war, Confederate irregulars. His voice was flat, emotionless, but Gabriella felt the depth of pain beneath the words. I'm so sorry, she whispered, her hand tightening on his. Sullivan's fingers curled around hers, warm and strong. It was a long time ago. But Gabriella knew that some wounds never truly healed, only became bearable with time. They sat in silence, connected by shared grief and the simple comfort of human touch. Try to sleep, Sullivan finally said, gently disentangling his hand from hers. Tomorrow will come soon enough. Gabriella nodded, though she doubted sleep would come easily. Thank you for telling me. Sullivan paused at the doorway, looking back at her. "No one's asked in a very long time," he said simply, then disappeared into the darkened main room. Morning arrived with pale light filtering through the cabin windows and the scent of coffee brewing. Gabriella dressed quickly in her now dry clothes and emerged to find Sullivan already preparing for his journey. "There's coffee and some cornbread," he said, not looking up from the saddlebags he was packing. "Should be enough food to last until I get back. Keep the fire low during the day so the smoke won't give away your position." Gabriella poured herself a cup of coffee, watching as Sullivan methodically checked his rifle and pistol. "How long will you be gone?" "2 days if all goes well, 3 at most." He finally looked up at her, his expression serious. "If I'm not back by the 4th day, there's a map in that drawer." He nodded toward a small writing desk. "It shows a route to a missionary outpost about 15 miles east. The priest there, Father Thomas, is a good man. He'll help you." The implication was clear: if Sullivan didn't return, it meant something had gone very wrong. Gabriella felt cold despite the warmth of the coffee cup in her hands. "I'll come back," Sullivan said, reading her fear. "That's a promise." "Be careful," Gabriella said, unable to articulate the strange tightness in her chest at the thought of him riding into danger on her behalf. Sullivan nodded once, then resumed his preparations. An hour later, he was ready to depart. He hesitated at the door, looking back at Gabriella with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Bar the door behind me," he instructed. "Don't open it for anyone but me." "I'll knock 3 times, pause, then twice more so you know it's me." Gabriella nodded, committing the pattern to memory. 3, pause, 2. Sullivan regarded her for a moment longer, as if memorizing her face. Then, with a quick nod, he was gone, the door closing firmly behind him. Gabriella moved to the window, watching as Sullivan mounted Thunder and rode away, his broad shoulders straight, his posture alert. Only when he had disappeared among the trees did she slide the heavy wooden bar into place across the door. The cabin felt suddenly larger and emptier without Sullivan's presence. Gabriella busied herself tidying up, exploring the small space that was to be her sanctuary for the next few days. Sullivan lived simply, a few books well worn from repeated reading, tools and weapons maintained with meticulous care, handmade furniture that spoke of skill and patience. On a shelf near the bed, she found a small, tarnished silver frame containing a daguerreotype of a family, a stern-faced man with Sullivan's jaw, a gentle-looking woman, and 3 children, including a boy of perhaps 12 who had Sullivan's eyes. Gabriella carefully replaced the frame, feeling as though she had intruded on something deeply private. This cabin, she realized, was more than just a remote hideaway. It was the place where Sullivan kept his memories, both precious and painful. The day passed slowly. Gabriella kept the fire burning low as instructed, read from Sullivan's small collection of books, and watched the forest through the windows for any sign of movement. As darkness fell, she lit a single candle, keeping it away from the windows. She slept fitfully that night, startling awake at every creak and rustle. By morning she was exhausted but determined to keep her wits about her. She ate sparingly, mindful of making the food last, and continued her vigilant watch. The second day was harder. Restlessness set in, along with a growing anxiety about Sullivan's safety. Had he reached Fort Benton? Had he found Marshal Cooper? Or had Judge Blackwell's men intercepted him? By the 3rd day, Gabriella was pacing the cabin, her nerves stretched thin. She forced herself to focus on practical matters, checking supplies, ensuring the bar across the door was secure, keeping watch through the windows. It was late afternoon when she heard the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching. Gabriella's heart leaped to her throat as she peered cautiously through a gap in the curtains. Relief flooded through her as she recognized Sullivan's broad-shouldered figure astride Thunder. She hurried to the door, her hand on the bar, ready to slide it free at his signal. The hoofbeats grew closer, then stopped. There was silence for a moment, then came the knock, 3 sharp raps, a pause, then 2 more. Gabriella lifted the bar and pulled open the door. Sullivan stood there, hat in hand, his face weary but his eyes lighting up at the sight of her. "You're back," she breathed, unable to contain her relief. "I promised I would be," he replied simply, stepping past her into the cabin and setting down the saddlebags he carried. Gabriella noticed he moved stiffly, favoring his left side. "Are you hurt?" Sullivan shook his head dismissively. "Just a disagreement with some fellows who didn't want me reaching Fort Benton, nothing serious." But when he removed his coat, Gabriella gasped at the dark stain spreading across his shirt just below his ribs. "You're bleeding," Sullivan glanced down as if surprised. "It's mostly stopped. Just opened up again on the ride back." "Sit down," Gabriella commanded, her fear for him overriding her usual deference. "Let me see." To her surprise, Sullivan complied without argument, sinking into a chair by the fire. Gabriella gathered clean cloths and water, then hesitated. "You'll need to remove your shirt," she said, a flush rising to her cheeks despite the seriousness of the situation. Sullivan unbuttoned his shirt with methodical movements, wincing slightly as he pulled the fabric away from the wound. Gabriella tried to focus solely on the injury, a long gash along his left side that, while not deep, had clearly bled considerably. "What happened?" she asked as she gently cleaned away dried blood. "Ran into a couple of the judge's men in a tavern," Sullivan explained. "They recognized me from Whispering Pines, asked too many questions about where I was headed." His jaw tightened. "They followed me out, one of them had a knife." Gabriella's hands stilled. "They could have killed you." "They tried," Sullivan said with grim humor. "They weren't very good at it." The implication hung in the air between them that the men who had attacked Sullivan were no longer a threat. Gabriella resumed her ministrations, her touch gentle but sure. "Did you find Marshal Cooper?" she asked, needing to focus on something other than the warm skin beneath her fingers or the steady rhythm of Sullivan's breathing. "I did. He was already in Fort Benton, as luck would have it. He's very interested in what you witnessed." Sullivan watched her face as she worked. "He wants to meet with you, but not until it's safe. He's gathering evidence against the judge and the Blackwell gang. Your testimony could be the final piece he needs. So we wait." Gabriella secured a clean bandage around Sullivan's torso, trying to ignore the solid muscle beneath her hands or the way his breath caught when her fingers brushed his skin. "We wait," Sullivan confirmed. "Cooper will send word when it's time. Could be a week, could be longer." Gabriella sat back on her heels, looking up at him. "Thank you for risking your life for me." Sullivan's eyes held hers, something unspoken passing between them. "I told you I would keep you safe. I meant it." The days that followed settled into an unexpected rhythm. Sullivan hunted and taught Gabriella how to dress game. She cooked and mended his clothes. They read aloud to each other in the evenings by firelight Shakespeare's sonnets, Dickens' tales, whatever books Sullivan had on his shelves. They talked, too, more openly than Gabriella had ever spoken with anyone. Sullivan told her of battles fought and comrades lost, of his journey west after the war, searching for peace he wasn't sure existed. She shared her own dreams of the bookshop she had hoped to open someday, of the places she had longed to see. "My father always said I was too independent for my own good," she admitted one evening as they sat before the fire, a chessboard between them. "He worried no man would want a wife who preferred ledgers to lace." Sullivan moved his knight, taking her bishop. "Your father worried about the wrong men," he said quietly, his eyes on the board. "A wise man values a woman's mind as much as her beauty." Gabriella glanced up sharply, but Sullivan's expression revealed nothing beyond concentration on the game. She moved her queen, putting his king in check. "Your move," she said, both of them aware she wasn't just talking about chess. Days turned into weeks. Spring advanced, bringing wildflowers to the clearing around the cabin and longer, warmer days. Sullivan built a small garden, and Gabriella planted seeds they had traded for at a distant homestead Sullivan occasionally visited for news and supplies. They were careful during these excursions, Sullivan always returning by different routes, watching for signs of pursuit. But as April turned to May with no word from Marshal Cooper and no sign of the judge's men, a tentative sense of security began to take root. It was during this time that something else began to grow between them, something neither was ready to name, but both increasingly acknowledged in small ways. It was in the way Sullivan's hand lingered when he helped Gabriella over a fallen log during their walks in the forest. It was in the way she found reasons to sit closer to him in the evenings, their shoulders occasionally touching as they read. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, they sat on the small porch Sullivan had built, watching as fireflies began to appear among the trees. "I used to catch them in jars when I was a girl," Gabriella said softly. "My mother would scold me, saying they needed to be free to find their mates." Sullivan smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. "My sisters did the same. They would release them in our room at night, much to my mother's dismay." Gabriella studied his profile, the strong line of his jaw softened by the fading light. "You never talk about what you plan to do after?" Sullivan was quiet for a long moment. "Never thought much about after," he finally admitted. "For a long time there was just the war, then surviving the war, then finding a place where the memories weren't so loud." He glanced at her. "What about you? What will you do when this is over?" Gabriella looked out at the fireflies dancing among the trees. "I don't know anymore. Everything I planned was connected to a life that doesn't exist now." She hesitated. "But I'm starting to think perhaps that's not entirely a bad thing." Sullivan's hand found hers in the gathering darkness, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. They sat in silence as night fell completely, neither willing to break the spell of the moment with words that might say too much or not enough. It was 2 days later that everything changed. Sullivan had gone hunting at dawn, promising to return by midday with fresh meat for smoking. Gabriella busied herself with household tasks, humming softly as she worked. The sound of approaching horses around noon brought a smile to her face, Sullivan returning earlier than expected. But as she moved to the window, the smile died on her lips. 3 riders were approaching the cabin, none of them Sullivan. Gabriella's heart hammered in her chest as she recognized the lead rider, Harlan Reed, one of Judge Blackwell's most trusted men. They had found her. Moving swiftly, Gabriella grabbed Sullivan's spare pistol from its hiding place and checked that it was loaded, just as he had taught her. Then she took up position beside the window, out of sight but able to see the approaching men. They dismounted about 20 yards from the cabin, Harlan gesturing for the others to spread out. "Miss Hayes," he called, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "We know you're in there. The judge just wants to talk." Gabriella remained silent, her mind racing. How had they found her? "Where was Sullivan?" "No need to make this difficult," Harlan continued, taking a step toward the cabin. "Come out now and no one needs to get hurt. It was a lie and they all knew it. Judge Blackwell didn't want to talk, he wanted her silenced permanently." "Miss Hayes," Harlan's voice hardened. "You have until the count of 10 before we come in and get you." Gabriella tightened her grip on the pistol. She had 6 shots. There were 3 men. Sullivan had taught her to aim carefully, to make each shot count, but could she actually pull the trigger? Could she take a life, even to save her own? 1, 2. The sound of a rifle shot cracked through the air and one of Harlan's men crumpled to the ground. The other 2 dove for cover as a second shot kicked up dirt at Harlan's feet. "That was a warning," Sullivan's voice called from somewhere among the trees. "The next one won't be." Relief flooded through Gabriella. Sullivan had returned in time, positioning himself in the forest where he had a clear shot at the intruders. "You're outgunned, Sullivan," Harlan shouted back. "The girl isn't worth dying for." "That's where you're wrong," Sullivan replied, his voice steady. "Now get on your horses and ride out. Tell the judge his days of terrorizing this territory are numbered. You're a dead man." Harlan snarled, but he was already backing toward his horse, his remaining companion doing the same. They mounted quickly, the companion dragging the body of their fallen comrade across his saddle. "This isn't over," Harlan called as they rode away. "The judge has men all over the territory." You'll never be safe. Gabriella watched until they disappeared from sight, her entire body trembling with the aftermath of fear and adrenaline. It was several minutes before Sullivan appeared at the edge of the clearing, rifle in hand, his expression grim. "Are you all right?" he asked as he reached her, his eyes scanning her for any sign of injury. Gabriella nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Sullivan set aside his rifle and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. "I thought I'd lost you," he murmured into her hair. "When I saw their tracks crossing mine, I thought I might be too late." Gabriella clung to him, the solid strength of him anchoring her against the tide of fear that threatened to overwhelm her. "How did they find us?" Sullivan's arms tightened around her. "I don't know. But they'll be back, and with more men next time." He drew back slightly, his hands framing her face. "We need to leave. Now." They packed quickly, taking only what was essential: food, weapons, a change of clothes. Sullivan saddled Thunder, then helped Gabriella mount. He took one last look at the cabin that had been their sanctuary before setting it ablaze. "They'll follow the smoke," he explained as he mounted behind her. "By the time they realize we're gone, we'll have a good head start." They rode hard through the afternoon and into the evening, following game trails and stream beds to mask their tracks. Gabriella's back ached from the pace and the tension, but she didn't complain. She understood the necessity of putting as much distance as possible between themselves and their pursuers. As darkness fell, Sullivan finally slowed their pace, guiding Thunder into a dense copse of trees beside a small stream. "We'll rest here for a few hours," he said, his voice rough with fatigue. "Can't risk a fire, though." They ate a cold meal of jerky and hard biscuits, sharing Sullivan's canteen of water. The night was cool and Gabriella shivered despite her jacket. "Come here," Sullivan said, settling with his back against a tree and opening his arms to her. Gabriella hesitated only briefly before nestling against him, her head tucked under his chin, his coat wrapped around them both. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's a place about 2 days' ride from here. An old trading post run by a friend of mine, a man named Caleb Winston. He's no friend of the judge. We'll be safe there while I try to get word to Marshal Cooper." Gabriella nodded, too exhausted to question further. The steady rhythm of Sullivan's heartbeat beneath her ear was oddly comforting, and despite the hard ground and the danger that pursued them, she soon drifted into sleep. She awakened to Sullivan gently shaking her shoulder. The sky was just beginning to lighten with the first hint of dawn. "We need to move," he said quietly. "I heard riders to the south about an hour ago." They continued their journey, stopping only briefly to rest and water Thunder. Sullivan was vigilant, constantly scanning their surroundings for signs of pursuit. By late afternoon, they had reached a series of rocky bluffs that offered some protection and a vantage point to watch their back trail. "No sign of them," Sullivan said as he returned from scouting. "But that doesn't mean they're not out there." They made camp in a shallow cave, Sullivan allowing a small fire now that they were farther from the cabin and in more defensible terrain. As they sat side by side, sharing a rabbit Sullivan had snared, Gabriella found herself studying his profile in the flickering light. "You could have left," she said suddenly. "When you saw them at the cabin, you could have hidden in the forest and let them take me. It would have been safer for you." Sullivan turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. "That was never an option." "Why?" Gabriella pressed, needing to understand what drove this man to risk everything for her. "Why are you doing all this?" Sullivan was quiet for so long that Gabriella thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough with emotion. "When the war ended, I came west with nothing but ghosts for company. I built that cabin, hunted, trapped, kept to myself, existed more than lived." His eyes found hers in the firelight. "Then you came along, running for your life, brave despite your fear. And something inside me that had been dead for a long time started to wake up." Gabriella's breath caught in her throat at the raw honesty in his words. Sullivan reached out, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from her face with a gentleness that belied his strength. "I told you I would be your safety," he continued. "What I didn't say was that you've become mine as well. For the first time in years, I have something to fight for besides memories." Gabriella leaned into his touch, her heart pounding with emotions she had been trying to deny for weeks. "I'm afraid," she admitted softly. "Not of the judge or his men, but of what I feel for you, of what happens when this is over." Sullivan's hand cupped her cheek, his thumb tracing the curve of her lower lip. "What do you feel, Gabby?" Instead of answering with words, Gabriella closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that was both question and answer. Sullivan's response was immediate, his arms drawing her closer as the kiss deepened, speaking volumes about feelings too complex for simple words. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Sullivan rested his forehead against hers. "Whatever happens," he promised, "we face it together." They reached the trading post late the next day, a collection of log buildings surrounded by a wooden palisade in a clearing beside a river. Sullivan was greeted warmly by a tall, gray-haired man with a booming laugh and a firm handshake. "Sullivan, you old wolf," Caleb Winston exclaimed. "Been wondering when you'd show your face again." His shrewd eyes took in Gabriella, still mounted on Thunder, and who might this lovely lady be? "Gabriella Hayes," Sullivan replied, helping her dismount. "She's under my protection, Caleb. We need a safe place to stay for a while." Caleb's expression grew serious as he took in Sullivan's grim tone and the way he positioned himself slightly in front of Gabriella. "Judge Blackwell's men were through here 3 days ago, asking questions about a woman matching her description. Didn't like the look of them, so I sent them on a false trail north." "Thank you," Gabriella said, grateful for this stranger's discretion. Caleb nodded, then gestured toward the largest building. "Come inside. Got stew on the fire and news you'll want to hear." The trading post's main building was warm and well-furnished, with pelts on the floors and walls lined with shelves of supplies. A young Native American woman was stirring a pot over the fire, and she smiled shyly at their entrance. "My wife, Morning Star," Caleb introduced her proudly. "Best cook in the territory and the reason I'm still alive after all these years of foolishness." Morning Star rolled her eyes at her husband's words but served them generous bowls of venison stew with freshly baked bread. As they ate, Caleb shared what he knew. "Marshal Cooper was through here about a week ago," he said, lowering his voice though there was no one else present. "Said he was close to having enough evidence to move against Judge Blackwell and the Blackwell gang, something about bank records and witness testimonies." Sullivan leaned forward, his bowl forgotten. "Did he leave any message for me?" Caleb nodded, reaching into his shirt pocket and withdrawing a folded piece of paper. "Said to give you this if you showed up." Sullivan read the note quickly, his expression clearing. "Cooper wants us to meet him in Copper Creek in 5 days. He's gathered enough evidence to present to the territorial governor, but he needs Gabby's testimony to complete the case. Copper Creek is 2 days' ride from here," Caleb said. "But you'll want to be careful. The judge's men are searching everywhere for you too." "We'll leave at first light," Sullivan decided, glancing at Gabriella for confirmation. She nodded, exhausted but determined. Caleb showed them to a small cabin at the edge of the trading post compound. "It's not much," he apologized, "but it's private and the bed's clean." "It's perfect," Gabriella assured him. "Thank you for your kindness." After Caleb left, Sullivan moved to check the windows and door, his vigilance undiminished despite the relative safety of the trading post. Gabriella watched him, noting the tension in his shoulders and the way his hand never strayed far from his pistol. "You should rest," she said gently. "I'll take first watch if you like." Sullivan shook his head, a small smile touching his lips. "Always the brave one," he said. "But I'm too restless to sleep just yet. You take the bed." Gabriella crossed to him, placing her hand on his arm. "We both need rest, Sullivan, and the bed is big enough for 2. His eyes darkened at her words, but he shook his head again. "Not like this, Gabby. Not when we're running for our lives and exhaustion is clouding our judgment." He covered her hand with his own. When this is over, when you're truly safe and can make your choice without fear driving your decisions, then ask me again." Gabriella understood his reasoning, even as part of her ached at the distance he imposed. It was yet another example of the honor that defined him, the same honor that had driven him to protect her at the risk of his own life. "Very well," she conceded, "but at least lie down beside me." "Just to rest." Sullivan hesitated, then nodded. They lay together on the narrow bed, fully clothed, his arm around her waist, her head pillowed on his shoulder. Despite his protestations of restlessness, Sullivan was asleep within minutes, the lines of worry smoothing from his face. Gabriella watched him for a while, memorizing the contours of his face before sleep claimed her as well. They left the trading post at dawn, Caleb providing them with fresh supplies and Morning Star pressing a small beaded pouch into Gabriella's hand. "For protection," she said in softly accented English, "and for love." They traveled cautiously, Sullivan choosing less traveled paths and frequently checking their back trail. The journey to Copper Creek was tense but uneventful, and they arrived late on the second day. Copper Creek was larger than Whispering Pines, but still small by Eastern standards, a single main street lined with businesses, a church at one end, and a scattering of homes radiating outward. Sullivan led them to a small boarding house on the outskirts of town, where an elderly woman greeted him with a warm smile. "Samuel Sullivan," she exclaimed. "It's been too long." "Hello, Mrs. Porter," Sullivan replied, his usual reserve softening. "We need a room if you have one available, Mrs." Porter's eyes flicked to Gabriella, then back to Sullivan, a question in her gaze. Sullivan cleared his throat. "Miss Hayes is under my protection," he explained. "She's in danger and we're meeting Marshal Cooper tomorrow." Understanding dawned in the older woman's eyes. "I have a room at the back of the house," she said. "Nice and private with its own entrance, and I know when not to notice comings and goings." "Thank you," Gabriella said gratefully as Mrs. Porter led them through the house to a small but clean room with a bed, a washstand, and a chair. "Dinner's in an hour," Mrs. Porter informed them. "I'll bring it to your room, less chance of being seen that way." Once they were alone, Sullivan removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair, his fatigue evident in the slump of his shoulders. "Get some rest if you can," he said. "Tomorrow will be a long day." Gabriella moved to stand before him, reaching up to touch his face gently. "We're close, Sullivan. This will soon be over." He caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm that sent warmth spiraling through her. "And then what, Gabby?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "What happens when you're no longer in danger and no longer need my protection? I'll always need you," she replied without hesitation. "Not for protection, but because you've become essential to me, like breathing." Sullivan pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as if afraid she might disappear. "When I saw those men at the cabin," he murmured against her hair, "I realized something. I realized I can't lose you, that whatever future awaits me, I want you in it." Gabriella leaned back slightly, looking up into his face. "Is that a proposal, Samuel Sullivan?" A smile touched his lips at her use of his full name. "Not yet," he said, his fingers tracing the curve of her cheek. "But a promise. Once this is over, once you're truly safe, I'll ask properly. If you'll let me." Gabriella's answer was to rise on her tiptoes and kiss him, pouring all her feelings into the gesture. Sullivan responded in kind, his arms tightening around her, the kiss deepening until they were both breathless. A knock at the door broke them apart. "Mrs. Porter's voice called that dinner was ready. They shared a smile, the promise of after hanging between them like a beacon of hope. The meeting with Marshal Cooper was set for noon the following day at the town's small church. Sullivan insisted on arriving early, checking the building and the surrounding area for any sign of danger. The church was empty save for a tall, lean man in a marshal's coat who rose from a pew as they entered. "Sullivan," he greeted, extending his hand. "Good to see you in one piece." His gaze shifted to Gabriella. "And you must be Miss Hayes. I'm James Cooper, U.S. Marshal. I've heard a lot about you." "Marshal," Gabriella acknowledged, shaking his hand. Sullivan says you're building a case against Judge Blackwell. Cooper nodded, gesturing for them to sit. I've been gathering evidence for months. Bank records showing suspicious deposits after gold shipments were robbed. Witness testimonies about the judge's association with known members of the Blackwell gang. But what I've been missing is someone who can directly link the judge to the gang's criminal activities. I saw them together, Gabriella confirmed. The judge was giving them information about upcoming gold shipments from the bank where my father worked. Cooper's expression was grim but satisfied. That's exactly what I needed. The territorial governor is sending a special investigator next week. With your testimony, we can finally bring Blackwell to justice. A week, Sullivan frowned. We need to keep Gabby safe until then. I've arranged for a secure location, Cooper assured them. A ranch about 20 miles from here, owned by a former ranger named Thomas Grant. No one knows you'll be there, and Grant's men are all trustworthy. Sullivan didn't look entirely convinced, but he nodded. When do we leave? Tonight, Cooper replied. After dark. Less chance of being seen that way. They spent the rest of the day at Mrs. Porter's boarding house, Sullivan cleaning his weapons while Gabriella wrote down everything she remembered about the meeting between Judge Blackwell and the gang members. The details were seared into her memory: the date, the time, the exact words spoken, the map of the gold shipment route that had been spread on the table. As dusk fell, Cooper arrived with a wagon, its bed covered with canvas. Lie down under the canvas, he instructed. I'll drive you out of town. Less conspicuous than riding. They did as instructed, lying side by side in the wagon bed, the canvas concealing them from view. Sullivan kept his rifle close, his body tense with readiness despite the marshal's assurances. The journey to the ranch was slow and uncomfortable, the wagon bouncing over rutted roads. Gabriella found herself pressed against Sullivan in the confined space, drawing comfort from his solid presence beside her. Almost there, Cooper called softly after what seemed like hours. Just another mile or so. That was when they heard it, the sound of approaching riders moving fast. Cooper's curse was barely audible over the thunder of hooves. Sullivan, he hissed urgently, we've got company. Sullivan was already moving, pushing aside the canvas just enough to peer out. How many? He asked, his voice taut. At least 6, Cooper replied, urging the horses to greater speed. Too many for us to fight in the open. The ranch? Sullivan asked. Too far, Cooper said grimly. There's an old line shack about a quarter mile ahead. We might make it. The wagon lurched forward as Cooper whipped the horses. Gabriella clung to the side of the wagon, her heart pounding in her chest. Here, Sullivan pressed his pistol into her hand. 6 shots, make them count if you need to. His eyes held hers in the darkness. Stay down, stay alive. The first gunshot cracked through the night air, followed quickly by more. Cooper cried out and the wagon swerved wildly as he slumped forward. Sullivan vaulted over the side of the wagon, grabbing the reins before the horses could bolt. Cooper's hit, he shouted to Gabriella. Stay down. He guided the wagon off the road and toward a dark shape that must be the line shack Cooper had mentioned. Bullets whined past them, one splintering the wood of the wagon just inches from Gabriella's head. The wagon skidded to a halt beside the small building. Sullivan leaped down, firing his rifle to provide covering fire as Gabriella scrambled from the wagon. Together, they dragged Cooper's unconscious form into the shack and barred the door behind them. The shack was little more than a single room with a dirt floor and no windows. Sullivan quickly assessed their situation, his expression grim in the faint moonlight that filtered through cracks in the walls. Cooper's alive, but the bullet went through his shoulder. He's lost a lot of blood. He tore strips from his shirt to bandage the wound. We're surrounded, outgunned, and they know exactly where we are. Gabriella checked the pistol he had given her, trying to control the trembling of her hands. What do we do? Sullivan moved to one of the walls, peering through a crack. They're setting up positions around us. They'll wait until dawn, then rush the shack. He turned to look at her, his face shadowed. I'm going to draw them off. No, Gabriella's protest was immediate and fierce. "You can't go out there alone." "I'm not asking, Gabby." Sullivan's voice was gentle but firm. "I'll lead them away from here. Once they're gone, you wait until nightfall, then get Cooper to the ranch. Grant's men will protect you until the governor's investigator arrives." Gabriella crossed to him, gripping his arms. "There has to be another way. We can fight them together." Sullivan's hands came up to frame her face. "There are too many of them. This is the only way to ensure you survive to testify." His thumbs brushed away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "And you have to survive, Gabby. Not just for the case against Blackwell, but because I can't bear the thought of a world without you in it." "And what about me?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "How am I supposed to bear a world without you?" Sullivan's answer was to kiss her desperately, thoroughly, pouring everything he couldn't say into the gesture. When he finally pulled away, his breathing was ragged. "I promise to be your safety," he reminded her. "This is me keeping that promise." Before she could argue further, he was checking his weapons, preparing to leave. "Wait until you hear me engage them to the east," he instructed. "Then get Cooper ready to move as soon as it's dark." Gabriella wanted to scream, to beg him to stay, but she knew he was right. Their only chance was for someone to draw off their attackers. Instead, she reached into her pocket and withdrew the small beaded pouch Morning Star had given her. "For protection," she said, pressing it into his hand. "And for love." Sullivan's fingers closed around the pouch, his eyes never leaving hers. "I will come back to you," he vowed. "That's a promise I intend to keep." Then he was gone, slipping through a loose board at the back of the shack and into the darkness beyond. Gabriella held her breath, counting the seconds, her entire being focused on the sounds outside. Minutes passed in tense silence. Then came the sound of gunfire to the east, followed by shouts and the thunder of hooves as their attackers gave chase. Gabriella waited until the sounds faded into the distance before turning her attention to Cooper. The marshal was pale but conscious, his eyes focusing on her with difficulty. "Sullivan?" he asked weakly. "Drawing them off," Gabriella replied, checking his bandage. "We need to get you to the ranch as soon as it's dark." Cooper nodded, wincing at the movement. "Grant's place, 3 miles northeast. Follow the creek." Gabriella spent the next hours tending to Cooper and preparing for their journey. She found supplies in the shack, an old canteen, some jerky, a moth-eaten blanket. As the day wore on, she strained to hear any sound of Sullivan's return, but there was only silence. Dusk finally came, bringing with it a light rain that would help mask their movements. Gabriella helped Cooper onto one of the wagon horses, then mounted the other herself. Together, they set off toward the northeast, following the small creek that wound through the landscape. The journey was slow and painful for Cooper, but he remained conscious, guiding them as best he could. It was fully dark by the time they saw lights ahead the windows of a large ranch house surrounded by smaller buildings. They were met at the gate by armed men who lowered their weapons when Cooper identified himself. Thomas Grant, a weather-beaten man with kind eyes, helped the marshal from his horse. "Where's Sullivan?" he asked, looking past Gabriella as if expecting to see him. "He led Blackwell's men away from us," Gabriella explained, her voice tight with worry. "That was hours ago." "He should have been back by now." Grant's expression grew grave. "My men will look for him at first light. For now, let's get you both inside and taken care of." The ranch house was warm and well-appointed, with a large main room dominated by a stone fireplace. Mrs. Grant, a capable woman with silver-streaked dark hair, tended to Cooper's wound and showed Gabriella to a room where she could rest. But rest was impossible. Gabriella paced the small room, pausing frequently at the window to search the darkness for any sign of Sullivan. As the hours passed and dawn approached with no word, her fear grew into a gnawing dread. "He's alive," she told herself firmly. "He promised he would come back." The first rays of sunlight were just breaking over the horizon when she heard a commotion in the yard below. Rushing to the window, she saw Grant's men gathered around a horse and rider. Her heart leaped to her throat as she recognized Thunder, and the slumped figure in the saddle Sullivan. Gabriella ran from the room and down the stairs, pushing past startled ranch hands to reach him as he was being helped from the saddle. His shirt was torn and blood-stained, his face pale beneath a layer of dirt and sweat, but his eyes were alert and searching until they found her. "Told you I'd come back," he said weakly, attempting a smile that turned into a grimace of pain. Gabriella was at his side instantly, supporting him as Grant's men helped him toward the house. "What happened? Where are you hurt?" "Took a bullet in the leg," Sullivan admitted. "But I led them on a merry chase before losing them in the hills. Don't think they'll be finding this place anytime soon." Inside, Mrs. Grant examined Sullivan's wound, a clean shot through the meaty part of his thigh. "You're lucky," she pronounced. "Missed the bone and major blood vessels. You'll be sore for a while, but it should heal clean." As she worked to clean and bandage the wound, Sullivan kept his eyes on Gabriella, as if reassuring himself that she was truly safe, only when Mrs. Grant had finished and left them alone did he reach for her hand, drawing her close to the bed where he lay. "I thought I'd lost you," Gabriella admitted, her voice breaking as the fear and tension of the past hours finally caught up with her. Sullivan's hand tightened around hers. "Never," he promised. "It would take more than a few of Blackwell's thugs to keep me from coming back to you." For the next 3 days, Sullivan recovered his strength while Cooper coordinated with the territorial governor's office via telegraph. Gabriella rarely left Sullivan's side, reading to him, helping him exercise his injured leg, simply being present as a reminder of what they were fighting for. On the 4th day, word came that the governor's investigator had arrived in Copper Creek with a contingent of federal marshals. Cooper, his shoulder healing well, prepared to take Gabriella's written testimony into town. "You both should stay here," he advised Sullivan and Gabriella. "The ranch is secure, and there's no need to risk being seen until we're ready to make arrests." Sullivan nodded his agreement, though Gabriella could tell he chafed at not being part of the action. His protective instincts were strong, and the idea of her testimony being used without him present to ensure her safety clearly troubled him. "Cooper knows what he's doing," she reassured him as they watched the marshal ride away. "And the sooner Judge Blackwell is arrested, the sooner we can think about that future you promised me." Sullivan's arm tightened around her waist. "I haven't forgotten that promise," he said softly. "Though I'm not sure what I have to offer a lady like you, I'm just a man with a burned-down cabin and too many ghosts." Gabriella turned in his arms to face him. "You offered me safety when no one else would," she reminded him. "You offered me your heart when I thought mine was broken beyond repair. That's more than enough for me." The kiss they shared was a renewal of promises made and kept, a bridge between the danger of their past and the hope of their future. 2 days later, Cooper returned with news that sent waves of relief and vindication through the ranch. Judge Blackwell and the leaders of the Blackwell gang had been arrested, their operations exposed by Gabriella's testimony and the evidence Cooper had gathered. The territorial governor had issued a formal commendation for Gabriella's courage and appointed a new judge to oversee the trials. "It's over," Cooper told them, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile. "You're free to go wherever you want, do whatever you want." That night, after a celebration dinner with the Grants and Cooper, Sullivan and Gabriella walked in the ranch's garden, the stars bright overhead and the future spreading before them like an uncharted wilderness. "So," Sullivan said, his hand warm around hers. "What does freedom look like to you, Gabby?" Gabriella considered the question seriously. "I still want that bookshop," she admitted. "Perhaps in one of the growing towns where families are settling and children need education." She glanced up at him. "But mostly, freedom looks like waking up beside you every morning and falling asleep in your arms every night." Sullivan stopped walking, turning to face her fully. In the moonlight, his expression was solemn, but his eyes were filled with a light she had come to recognize as love. "I have something to ask you," he said, his voice steady despite the nervousness she could feel in the slight tremor of his hand. I promised I would ask properly when you were truly safe. Gabriella's heart beat faster as Sullivan, mindful of his healing leg, lowered himself carefully to one knee before her. From his pocket, he withdrew a small circle of silver, not a traditional ring, but a band he had fashioned himself from a silver dollar during his recovery, carefully polished until it gleamed in the moonlight. Gabriella Hayes, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I promised to be your safety, but you've become mine as well. You've shown me that there's more to life than just surviving, that there's joy and purpose in loving someone with your whole heart. He held up the silver band. I'm asking you to marry me. To build that bookshop, to make a home with me, to face whatever comes next together. Tears blurred Gabriella's vision as she looked down at this man who had risked everything for her, who had taught her the true meaning of courage and love. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, Samuel Sullivan. I will marry you. Sullivan slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to his feet, pulling her into an embrace that spoke of promises kept and a future secured. As his lips found hers, Gabriella knew with absolute certainty that she had found not just safety, but the place where she truly belonged in the arms of the man who had vowed to protect her, and in doing so had saved them both. In the years that followed, the legend of Sullivan and Gabriella Hayes Sullivan would become part of the territory's lore, how a brave young woman and the cowboy who protected her brought down a corrupt judge and one of the most notorious gangs in the West. Their bookshop in the growing town of Riverton became a gathering place for settlers and travelers alike, with Sullivan's handcrafted shelves holding volumes of knowledge and adventure for all who sought them. They had 3 children, 2 sons with their father's steady gaze and quiet strength, and a daughter with her mother's courage and determination. Sullivan taught his children to ride and hunt and respect the land, while Gabriella taught them to read and question and stand up for what was right. And each night, as they retired to the home they had built together, Sullivan would take Gabriella's hand, the hand that still wore the silver band he had made for her, and thank whatever fate or providence had brought her into his life that night in Whispering Pines, when a frightened young woman had needed protection, and a lonely man had found his purpose in 4 simple words. Then I'll be her safety.